basically skip past that we want to serve, because if you wouldn't be here if you didn't. You know, exactly what do you want to accomplish, and we'll just start with you, Tim, and we'll work our way down.
Great, thank you. I think for me right now, this is the most transformational time in the history of public education in California. I think right now with Common Core, you know, which fundamentally changes how we teach and how students learn, with the LCFF changing how schools are funded, and with the new accountability system, I think there's never been a more important time in the history of public education. And I think my broad background, which is really what interests me in running in public education as a teacher, teaching not just the academic classes like economics and civics, but also construction, trades, independent study for at-risk, all across the board, middle school. I think I have a broad perspective that I want to take as these sweeping changes are implemented in California. I think I have that broad perspective that I'll always kind of use as a frame of reference as any of these policies are implemented.
I like that. You probably got it down to a minute. I appreciate that.
Well, for me, there are three primary issues that caused me to run and really motivated me to run, and it's education, our economic environment in this state, and the financial stability of the state, so we don't have a burden on our children going forward. In education, I'm the only parent in this race of school-age children actually living and experiencing our education system firsthand, and its strengths and its weaknesses, and seeing firsthand how our education challenges are not solved simply by sending more money at the status quo, and seeing the dramatic changes we need to make. And I bring a very unique perspective, and that is a parent actively involved. I serve on our school site council, I serve on our local control funding formula advisory committee, and have chaired a local preschool here in the San Ramon Valley. So education is a very important one, but also economic prosperity in this state. I come from a family business background from my own family as growing up, and also serve primarily as an advisor to small family businesses in this area trying to get started and succeed. I see how the state is making it more difficult than absolutely necessary for employers to create jobs and for employees to have good jobs, and I intend to be a part of fixing that.
Well, I'm running to win this assembly seat, but more importantly, I'm running to change the culture of Sacramento.
That's good. Okay. Go ahead.
Jan, you okay?
Yeah, I'm good.
I think that most people can see that it's a very polarized legislature.
No, I was just, that you're actually running to win is the first I've heard. It's the first person who said that in all the years I've been doing this. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Do I get a retake on
that? Yeah, go ahead, retake. I'm sorry, just starting this one. Yeah.
All right. Most people who are watching state politics today realize it's pretty dysfunctional. It's very polarized. That you have two parties representing the extremes, and not a lot of people in the center in Sacramento that are able to work across party lines to solve the big problems that our state is facing. And I have a record of independence from interest groups, from leaders in my party that can work hard for what I think are the common purposes for serving. 10 years on my city council has allowed me to hone my skills and experiences, and I think I can deliver for the district. I think I can represent this community well and make sure that our priorities and needs are taken care of.
No?
I've spent the past 19 years developing methodologies and the skills to create high level of services in the most cost-effective way. I ran for office originally in Danville because I was embarrassed by how bad the finances were. Danville made national news, FBI investigation, a total mess. Clean house, new leadership. We have no debt. We have no post-retirement obligations. We're one of the most cost-effective cities around. And we have found a model of how you can provide high level of government services in a multitude of ways and provide really high-paying jobs. I've owned a business for 36 years. I make payrolls. I have one on the 24th. I will lose sleep the night before, as I always have for 36 years. The difference, I think, between all of us sitting here, I'm the only one who really owns a company, who makes payrolls, who got into politics to make a difference, as everybody says, but actually proved how to do that. We have an opportunity at the state level to take some of those ideas of how to make our agencies deliver high-quality services in a more cost-effective way. I'm running because I think I can make a difference, and I think I've got those skills, and I'm not backed by Sacramento. I'm not backed by the public employee unions. I'm backed by people from our district.
I want to run down for you folks of several policy issues in the next few minutes. And what I would really like you to do with each of them is give me the 30-second answer and no more, if you could. We're going to start with high-speed rail. Tim, do you support it in its current form or not?
I do support high-speed rail. I think what we need to do is, there are some legitimate concerns that have been raised. I think financial, the impacts on community, the impacts on the environment. So I think part of the legislature's priority should be figuring out how to solve those problems, because I do think anytime we can connect the state better in terms of moving people and moving goods is a good thing, but we have to do it responsibly. We have to address the concerns that are out there. So as a legislator, that's one of the things I want to take on front and center.
So your concerns are impact on the community and impact on the environment.
And economic. I mean, clearly the economic, how it's going to be funded is probably the first and foremost. So,
Okay,
really.
so if you had to vote today, given what you know today, because there's actually going to be another vote probably coming soon, and there was a vote last year.
Yeah.
For or against it?
I would vote for it. And I think the business plan that was recently released, it shows that there's an increased potential in ridership, obviously decrease in potential revenues, so those issues that need to be dealt with. But I think it's too important for our state's future to vote down, up or down. But I think we need to solve the problems that have been identified front and center.
Catherine?
I don't think we need to change it, I think we need to scrap it. High-speed rail has every single red flag that any responsible leader would look at and say, we need to stop doing this and we need to stop now. It has operating deficits as far as the eye can see. It has cost overruns that almost came into place the day after the original measure was passed. Ridership is at half is what it's going to be expected, and other independent analyses show it's 2/3. You have also the contractor who's going to be working on it has the lowest safety rating, and we can't get funding for it. No private funding that was promised to us when this ballot measure passed has materialized, and it won't, because it's not a recipe for a successful, smarter investment in California. California has embraced innovation, they embrace technology, but that's not what we have here. So a clear answer is I would vote no, and I would vote to discontinue it and make smarter infrastructure investments in our own community.
Steve?
Well, when you think about our infrastructure long term, we have so many transportation elements of it that are going to be constrained, and we have to plan for the future. Philosophically, I like high-speed rail, and I like intercity rail, but I think you have to have a financial plan that pencils out. I don't see one in terms of what's on the table today, and therefore I would vote against high-speed rail, given the plan that I see.
This is another Bay Bridge.
I don't understand.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Neil.
It's another Bay Bridge project. Starts out with a great idea, and it ends up being a mess, and it's financially out of control. Voting for it today, given all of the other infrastructure needs that we have, the fact is I'd vote no. I support doing high-speed rail. I recently took a trip from London to Brussels to Paris, back to London all in one day, had breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and I left at 7 a.m., got back at 10. It works. Unfortunately, the way we've started this is just really misguided.
So how would you vote?
No.
Okay, there's a bill currently pending, we'll start with you, Newell. There's a bill currently pending in the State Assembly that would provide public agency attorney, regarding public agency attorney billing records when they're in regard to pending litigation. It would exempt those billing records until the cases are settled, until the pendency of the litigation is complete. Good idea, bad idea?
This is for outside attorneys or those
For outside attorneys.
outside attorneys? Well, if you're under litigation, and I've sat in those closed sessions, and occasionally we hire an outside attorney, and I don't know all the details of that bill, to be honest.
It's pretty straightforward. It's just pretty much the way I described it.
Yeah, I would think that that's unusual, that it is that simple. You know, keeping them confidential, if I'm hiring an attorney, they may have 12 experts. It can show up on that detail. I think at the time it should be confidential until the case is settled and it's public record at that point. Otherwise, you're negotiating against yourself.
Steve?
Well, I'm for government transparency in every way, shape, or form. But I have to say, Dan, I really need to read the bill, and I think I need to hear from all sides. I don't feel like just that explanation gives me the feeling that I understand the issue. So in all due respect, my philosophical view is we should do everything we can to have transparency, but I'd like to understand more.
Well, the issue's pretty clear, you know, it's the billing records, exempt or non-existent,
Yeah,
exempt
but
from the public records.
it's clear to you. I have 30 questionnaires, and it's more than 600 questions. They think it's pretty simple too, okay? And they ask for yes or no answers, and they ask for 30-second explanations, and sometimes that's not reasonable.
Have you filled them
So-
out?
Yeah, I want to ask you guys about that.
Catherine?
I believe that transparency in government is essential, and it's been under attack under the Democratic legislature this last year, as we know. Sunshine provisions and efforts to keep public records accessible to people. The one thing that we would need to make sure that we do is protect the confidentiality that the local government has in its billing records with its attorneys. And that's something that can be very good for the cities to have zealous representation for their needs. You don't want to be disclosing billing records that reveal what strategy is and how the priorities have been run in a case. I think you should certainly have access to what the costs have been. And I would really want to know more about what we can be doing to contain those costs and to make the competitive bidding process on legal services more transparent. But I don't think a solution to either costs or transparency is to have your confidential information that is paid for by the city, that is paid for by taxpayers, revealed to the other side. So that's where I stand on that one.
Tim?
Yeah, I believe in public access to the costs, I think is important because those are public dollars. So I think that should be disclosed. I think some of the very specific billing records that might reveal strategy or specific attorneys or specific, pieces of it, I would have a concern with that. So the way you described the bill, I would probably support as amended to reflect that piece. The public has a right to know the cost, and that way they can question the cost of their representatives. But I think the specifics should be held confidential until the trial's settled.
Agreed.
I'm sorry.
I agree with that. That's a good context.
I think it'd be important to ask why the state would need to be passing that instead of the local accountable entities making these decisions themselves. And they're most accountable to people at the local level. There's a tendency for the state level to want to micromanage city government, and I wouldn't want that to be another example.
Good idea, bad idea. Let's start with you. Well, actually start with Steve. We'll mix it up here. Good idea, bad idea. 2011, Jerry Brown signed a bill that gives labor the right, when negotiations break down, to demand a non-binding fact-finding inquiry before most local governments can impose terms when negotiations break down. Good idea, bad idea.
Well, Dan, I mean, I'll give you my opinion on it, but you're asking some very specific prescriptions to issues, and I think that if you want us to be thoughtful representatives, I think that you need to give us the ability to be thoughtful and reflective and hear from all issues on things like that. So what I'm hearing from you is a fact-finding requirement, a good idea as a state mandate in collective bargaining. Am I saying that right?
The way the bill is written and was signed and has been the law for the last 3 years, and it's certainly nothing new, it's been written about in the paper, we've written about it, is that when negotiations break down, before local government can impose, labor can demand a fact-finding inquiry.
Yeah. Well, I think we need to give local government the freedom to negotiate in good faith with labor, with the unions, and make the best judgment they can about what they feel is in the interest of their constituency. So from a philosophical point of view, I think we need to minimize state mandates in a whole variety of places. And given what you've told me, the little I know about this issue, I would say that it's not a good idea.
Mixing it up, Tim?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that I would probably support that, although I agree with the concept that, I think state mandates on local government, I mean, that's something that I'm sensitive to as a city official, as a mayor and a council member. But I think, when negotiations break down and you're talking about, contracts and services and impacts on communities, I think it is important to have, neutral fact-finding, information that could be helpful for both sides as well as the public. So I would support that.
I think we saw a sample of this, and I haven't read the legislation, but I think I understand some about it from how it played out in the BART strike, which affected our community deeply. And the fact-finding can be a cost, it can be a delay in reaching a solution and holding much more leverage for one party over the other in negotiations like that. I think I'd rather see a limited cost on something like that, and I'd much rather see the local parties decide when they're going to have any fact-finding necessary. I can't imagine that the local entities that are most involved in what's going on in the negotiations can't know for themselves what the facts are. I think what's more important is the transparency of that collective bargaining process and sunlight for it, and even some public comment on it, especially when so much is at stake. And I'm not sure that a fact-finding does that. And I certainly know in the BART situation it made for a delay in the inevitable, which was a strike, and I'm not sure that served any good purpose or provided any facts that were necessary, and I'm sure it cost something, which we pay for.
No, it's, the context of that, it was a give back to labor trades. Most elected folks barely have the backbone to make the tough decisions when it comes to negotiating. And when it comes down to, it's not them against us, it's economics. And Sacramento has spent decades of legislation, and this is another example of that, of making it harder for local governments to make the tough decisions. As not only as a council member, as a business, if you have somebody that intercedes and says, gee, sorry, you can't do this, you gotta wait, and you're going to go bankrupt, you have to have the ability to make those tough decisions. The transparency is already there. All the financial records of public agencies, negotiating units, all have complete access to that. They don't have to go through a formal process to get to that. They always have that right. So no, we got to stop that type of legislation.
Let's go, and I think you may have hinted at this in my next question, Catherine.
Mm-hmm.
I'll start with you, Noel. Is transparency in negotiations. Should there be, and we have written about, for example, the Costa Mesa model, where the offers and counteroffers in public negotiations are made public as they go, and that there's a public opportunity to comment on labor settlements. Good idea, bad idea?
It's a great idea. Right now, the only comments we hear are both sides, and they're obviously giving us their opinion. I mean, if you look at some of the strikes, BART would be an example. If they're going to give away all the money, why don't we, the taxpayers, because it's us, why don't we vote on it at the end? So the idea of coming up with transparency during the negotiations, to me, is revealing facts, where everybody stands, and not a biased opinion standing in front of the camera. Government does need to be transparent. It needs to be calm, reflective, and factual.
Tim?
Well, I have an interesting perspective because I've literally sat on both sides of the table in the same day. Both as a teacher during the day and then as mayor in the evening. I understand the goal behind it. I think transparency.
As a teacher's negotiator.
Yeah, helping with the roundtable negotiations. One of the things I would say is this: I understand the transparency behind it, and I think the goals are laudable. My concern would be that I think a lot of every contract at that point would be negotiated through the media. And one of the things about negotiations is they're very sensitive on both sides. You can't talk about it, and I think sometimes you have offers, counter offers, and you get a deal. When the process works, it works really well. BART's a clear example where it was a debacle. Sometimes that happens where it doesn't work. But, both sides kind of that give and take during the course of the negotiation. I'm concerned if, then everything's in the public, counter offer, and I just think it'll be too politicized. And I think it'll have unintended negative consequences.
At least the public can weigh in.
you would oppose it?
I would oppose it, yes.
Catherine?
I think it's really important that when we've seen mistakes made, we learn from them and fix them. And that's what we have an opportunity to do from the BART strike. It's just one example. And one correction is the transparency of the process. And I think Costa Mesa has led the way on this. I think it would have helped our community have much more control over what they were so directly affected by. And so I would support that. I think we need to be careful that we don't turn over the process to the media for how to negotiate. I think what's more important is that we make sure that the leaders have a backbone. And when they're held accountable by the folks who are seeing in the community what the contracts are and what the counter proposals are, that's the best opportunity for us. And it requires taking a bold position, and that is making those negotiations more public and more transparent and open to some voter content and approval.
Steve?
In general terms, I like the idea. I don't think I think one of the problems that continues to come out in some of these contentious negotiations are where at the end of the process, the concessions that management has offered up, the public never gets a chance to react to, and it's all of a sudden it's a deal. And I think we saw that in the BART strike negotiations. I think we see it. Our fire district just came out and supposedly settled a contract a few days ago. This is our independently elected fire board, and that proposal was never floated, so the public had a chance to react to it. I think that's very unfortunate. I think we've seen time and again where in these negotiations there's pressure externally from the represented group of employees through the unions, and the management side, they stay silent, and all of a sudden there's a concession at the end, and the public themselves have never really had a chance to weigh in. I think if there was transparency, I think we would get more on the management side, representing the taxpayers, to have a better backbone to stand up for what they can afford.
So
for the taxpayers.
that's a supporting the concept?
Yes.
So if I've got this right, we've got 3 yes, 1 no. Do I have that right?
That's correct.
We'll send that out to fact finding.
Okay, so since we keep coming up with BART, quickly here, then let's, I don't think I've started with you yet, Steve, have I?
You have, but you can.
Oh, have I? Okay.
You're in charge.
Okay,
So
I've lost track.
You can start with Catherine.
we could go to
Right.
fact finding again.
Great
on that.
topic to start with me on.
BART, should BART workers be able to strike?
No, and I was the only candidate in this room and to actually come out boldly and publicly and affirmatively for legislation to ban BART strikes. A specific legislation that was pending in Sacramento that could actually have been passed if we'd come together to do it. I took a very different approach than my colleagues, and I
Okay, what would you give up to ban BART strikes?
Well, first of all, I challenge the question that you have to give something up to ban BART strikes. The first thing we need to do is to ban them and ban transit strikes in the state. And secondly, I'd first of all much rather not see Sacramento micromanage what's going to be in place and have our local entities and local communities that are accountable to the voters decide what's going to be in its place. There is such a temptation at the state level to tinker with every single thing that happens at the local level. We've all talked about it here today, but that's just like the question underlies that tendency. What you absolutely want to avoid happening is replacing one uneven, bad bargaining situation with another. For example, through one binding arbitration proposal.
So you would oppose binding arbitration?
I would oppose binding arbitration as every matter I've seen it proposed. I'm an attorney. I've seen how the arbitration system is gamed, and
Okay,
I know.
so, and let me just, so you do not think BART workers should strike, and you would not offer up binding arbitration as an alternative, as part of a deal to get rid of it?
Well, first I don't think there needs to be a deal to get rid of it. We change the law and we let the local entities then decide in their communities what are they going to put in its place. What I do know is that just simply turning over 60% of BART's operating budget to an unaccountable elected official who can be, really have an incentive not to make one side or the other unhappy because their next job in binding arbitration is going to come from those same people is not a correct solution to go down. And that's the proposals I've seen so far. There's many other better options should a local government need to decide. But Sacramento needs to resist these temptations to micromanage, but we absolutely have to end strikes in this state. And I was the first candidate who was willing to come out on specific legislation.
I get it.
And not just
That's why the
talk.
cameras, see, that gets in the way of having a conversation.
Steve, you have sort of, you,
'Cause I wasn't the first.
you have been clear that you oppose BART strikes, but you have not been clear on what, if anything, you're willing to trade for that.
Yeah.
Where are
'cause
you at?
I haven't seen anything that I'm willing to trade it for. I think BART is an essential service here in the Bay Area, and that strikes should be banned as they are in so many other major urban centers in America.
Well, I wanna be real clear here on this, okay? Because in our past conversations, you kinda danced around the answer to the question.
Right, because Dan,
right.
well,
Yeah,
show me an
so
arbitration that I think is acceptable. What's an arbitration?
Okay, so I
So-
guess, no, what I'm what I'm specifically asking is,
Yeah.
do you support just a straight out
I do.
strike ban?
Yes.
Or do you support a strike ban in exchange for binding arbitration?
I'm surprised that you're still confused on that,
Okay.
okay? Because everything that I have said, I was the first elected official
Right.
in the Bay Area to come out against BART. There's a reason that $1 million has been raised against me in this race so far, led by the BART unions, because I stood up to them and I said they should not have the right to strike. I didn't say there should be a trade.
Okay.
I didn't say there should be an exchange. I didn't lay down any conditions. I said simply, it's an essential service, it's too important, and they shouldn't be allowed to
Fair
serve.
enough.
What specific legislation did you endorse?
I
SB
spoke with Senator
423?
Huff's office
Mhm.
about his bill, okay, before his bill was even out there. So, I've been very clear that they should not have the right to strike, okay?
Okay.
And I don't think anybody that's paid any attention would see it differently.
No?
You know, be careful what you ask for. That, you know, right now the way the law works is, and there's only one group, which has a couple of entities underneath that have a no strike clause, and that's public safety. And guess what they have? They have binding arbitration. Binding arbitration is the law right now. So if you take that away, this is the United States. You know, in the 20th century, labor laws were the most important things that built our country.
Let's have a clarification of facts here. Some have binding arbitration, some do not.
Right, but the fact is that the majority do, and the
No,
reason
actually, the majority in California do not.
that I'm corrected on that. The fact is that to take away something because you're angry at a group of people, I don't use BART very often. My office has always been located near BART. We go to San Francisco. The reality is as much as it's inconvenient, do you want to take away a right that all of us have? We all have a right to protest. In my company, people can come up to me and say, Newell, I need a raise and I'm a good guy. And I can sit there and have that conversation. So if we're going to take away a right and you're going to say you're not going to give them something, I think that's unfair. And I don't care whether you're for or against unions. I just don't think it's a one-sided conversation. But if we had the transparency issue and the Costa Mesa model in place, we wouldn't have been having a strike. They also have a no-strike clause in their contract while they're under contract. And had
Okay,
they,
so let me just I just wanna be real clear on where you're at on this question. So you would oppose a no strike provision?
if
no
it had
strike-
binding arbitration.
You would oppose it if it had binding arbitration. Would you oppose it if it was this flat out no strike provision?
If it had a no-strike clause with some, I think in fairness to people, some other give back someplace, but not a binding arbitration.
Okay, so you would oppose, you would support no strike with some give back, but not with binding arbitration?
Correct. Clear as can be.
Okay, thank you. I mean, I think, well, first off, obviously, everyone suffered during the BART strike. Nobody wins during a strike, and the process was a debacle. There's culpability all around, and I think you've identified, you know, some of the provisions there, some of the problems, as well as some solutions in this paper. What I would say, though, is I believe that collective bargaining and the right to strike is a fundamental right. And I think it's not as simplistic as that just by banning BART strikes, you're just going to make everything better at BART. I think that's a simplistic way to look at things. There's a lot of things that need to happen internally that the BART board needs to get a handle on, along with management. And I also think, if I were to look at anything as a state, I think the role of state legislators is limited in this area. But I do think Senator DeSaulnier, some of the things he's looking at in terms of bringing in the controller's office or the auditors, again, fact-finding I do believe is helpful early in the process, neutral facts, and maybe getting an outside entity, introducing that into the process, I think would be helpful. But, you know, I do support the right of workers to strike.
you, Tim.
Okay.
Universal preschool. Do you support it?
I like the concept of early childhood education, and I think we need to do more, particularly in low-income communities. My concern is the cost and the facilities. Like I look at Dublin Unified, for example, we're a growing district, and all of our facilities are maxed out. So where you would put these preschool students is a question. So I think the state maybe targeting some of that money for, in communities of need, I think is a good thing, but to make it universal, I would have concern about cost and the ability to accommodate them. So that would be my concern.
As a parent who has researched and sat in on and helped my own family select a preschool for my children, as well as a former preschool board commissioner running a local preschool in the San Ramon Valley, a very particular and unique perspective on this. Preschool is one of the last areas where families and parents have absolute choice on where they send their children and how they best match their children with different educational opportunities. And I do believe that more families, particularly those who cannot afford preschool options that many others can, should have greater access to preschool. I do not believe the solution is for the state to increase K through 12 into lower grades and have a continued
Back up,
provide
I'm
that.
sorry, maybe I misheard you. Just back up about a sentence,
Okay.
maybe I wasn't tracking. Okay, so what do you support then?
Okay, I support families having greater access to preschool options. I do not support the state running preschools with state funding. I'd much rather see families have the choice to, and financial support, to go to whatever preschool a parent decides best matches their children. You see choice in preschools, and what you see is a variety of different options. You see education, academic, you see developmental, Montessori, and the 10 different types of Montessori, and parents can decide what best matches for their child, full-time, part-time, co-op, and otherwise. As soon as they go into the public school system, they lose that choice. And much rather than seeing our costs increase and have our schools subsume a whole nother age group, I'd much rather see financial support for families to have the options of sending their children to preschools that they either can't afford now.
So you'd rather see the state put some money in financial support for?
Tuition support, even
based on needs assessment?
yes, it would be a needs assessment, and there's a bill, AB 943, I think it is right now, that's a very creative way to do that. But the wrong solution is to, I think it would, if the state starts to get in the business of preschool as it has in our public education system, we're going to see choice taken away, except from families who can afford not to do
You don't
that.
want to see K-12 expanded?
Correct.
Okay.
I mean, I've seen the power of choice on how a school is operated and what it does for families, and we've got to maintain that in preschool.
Well, it'd be wonderful if we could provide universal preschool. But there's a finite amount of money that the state has available. And I think and you'd say, well, are we adequately funding K through 12 now, doing all the things we need to do in K through 12? Are we adequately funding our university system today? Are we adequately funding the healthcare safety net? So as you look through all the elements of state programming, I think before you even look at this, you have to say, are we doing our jobs well with what we're supposed to do right now? And I think when you look at the financial side of it, you have to look down the road, not this year and next year, but what this means for the budget in the long term.
Okay, so the simple answer, if I will not mean to, is that there are higher priorities right now.
Yeah, I like the idea, but I think you have to be able to pay for it, and you have to be sure that what we're doing now as a state, the programming that we're running now is adequately funded, and I don't think anybody feels that way about K through 12, our university system, and many other things that the state does.
Take a good look at AB 943. It's an alternative to the state funding of that.
Newell?
You know, I just got a call. It was from my wife. She knew you were talking about this because I've personally been a big believer in preschool.
She knew I was talking about it.
Absolutely. She has her ears open. That's her background, is early childhood education. Our children started in Montessori school at 2.5. By the time they got to kindergarten at 5 years old, they both could read, write, and they're prolific in those areas. Children learn more knowledge between age 2.5 and 5 than they do the rest of their life. It's all of language, it's all of mental capability. You refine it after that. Research is really clear on it. You can argue about philosophies of how you pay for it and its government. The fact is, we don't argue about K-12. It's a really important asset, and particularly in lower socioeconomic groups, it's the opportunity to set the patterns to instill the creativity, to instill the aspirations to get people out there. So I support it. It's 18 to 20% more of our $56 million budget to be able to create that. I don't know where we're going to get the money, but it's something that I think, whether it starts now or we have a 5-year plan or a 10-year plan to get there, we should start planning for it now. It's important.
Okay, so let's use this as a jumping off point and start with you, Noel. How's the state budget by your assessment?
Well, wait a minute, before we do that.
Okay.
Since we're on schools, I don't wanna jump back before we
Okay.
get to schools. There've been a number of efforts over the last 3 to 4 years. And if you don't know that, you're not reading you're not reading our paper. Efforts in the state legislature to increase reporting requirements and for suspected child abuse, not only reporting requirements but also training, that sort of thing. We'll start with you, Noel. You're probably going to get a chance to vote on that again. What are your thoughts on it? What would you vote for? What wouldn't you vote for?
You mean in terms of either more or less of that?
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
And how would it be implemented? I mean, there's been several specific bills which frankly are blocked by teachers. The CTA gets what it wants.
Different from teachers, it's a
Yes,
CTA.
well, I understand that very much, but the teachers allow them to speak for them, so, you know, they cede the right as far as I'm concerned. So that's where it's been blocked. And what is your position on that thing generally, and in specifics, what would you like to see? Do you think it needs to be improved?
It does need to be improved. I see it and I hear it every night when my wife comes home, from all of our teacher friends, from the other administrators that we see. You know, as we move along and add more of that transparency and more of that reporting out, it's like when you're tuna fishing, occasionally you catch a dolphin. You're finding parents are pushing back in some places because occasionally a child says something that sounds, but the reporting laws are so clear that you have to report that out and it turns out to be innocent. I feel it's better to err on that side, and there are too many cases, and there's some in East County, of male teachers suggesting, doing inappropriate things, and the reporting didn't happen. It's now a law. Not only is it that you have to contact your superintendent, you have to contact the police. Those are the checks and balances. And just like in everything, when we have laws for something, you're occasionally going to pick up an innocent person, but the system presumes you're going to be innocent, and that will reveal itself. I support those, and we have to actually clean up some more of those, and we should have a better partnership. It's not about protecting the bad teachers or the bad employee. It doesn't make a difference. This is true of local government. I mean, look what happened in Walnut Creek. It doesn't make any difference what profession you're in. We need to be more transparent. We need to stand up. I expect that in my own organization as a private employer. But boy, on a public, we have to stand up for that. And there should be nobody that can make an argument against that, period.
Steve?
Well, it's all about protecting the kids, so it's not about protecting the administrators or protecting the teachers. It's about, you know, ensuring due process, but it's about protecting the kids, and I think that's the frame in which I look at any of those bills. I certainly think that the reporting requirement is appropriate, and we need to make sure that we continue to educate and train and look for every avenue to ensure that that those rules and regulations are enforced. So.
I do support legislation that will require and train teachers on the reporting requirements, what to report, who to report it to report it to law enforcement and child protection services, not just one or the other. I think the whole example we've had, and unfortunately it's been in our own community and unfortunately it's happened in the last 18 months, is a great example of how our education system as it's managed in Sacramento is behind the curve. There's no reason why we shouldn't have had training much earlier on this. The current legislation that's pending, I know Susan Bonilla has a bill, there's other bills on reporting. They are improvements, but they are lacking and missing one complete area. In fact, this paper has missed this area in its coverage of this issue, and that is training on how to avoid the circumstances that lead to abuse in the first place. This is training that every other youth organization in the country has learned the hard way they have to have. Scouts, in which I'm very actively involved, YMCA, church organizations, they've learned that you can't just train people on how to report. You have to train people regularly, every 2 to 3 years, on how to avoid the circumstances that lead to child abuse to begin with.
You're talking about training the kids?
No, talking about training the same teachers. Training, for example, these are measures that I found chairing our local safety committee that we don't have. Things like, take the example of the Scouts. You have the rule of 3 deep. You're not alone in a room with a child. You're not alone transporting a child. You have rooms with windows. There's a 10-point, I think it's a 45-minute video I have to take before I can go to summer camp with my son as a leader or be an archery instructor at Girl Scout camp, which I am. And that video doesn't just tell me, here's how I report once I think I see a problem. It's circumstances to avoid. And the fact that Sacramento has been silent on this, despite all the reporting you've had and despite the terrible problems we've had in our community, it shows that we don't have enough of a voice for parents closer to this issue in our local communities and youth organizations. And that would be legislation that I would introduce very early in my career as an assembly person for this district.
Most of us have this, by the way, in our
Sam?
organization.
Absolutely. I mean, this to me, I mean, anything we can do to protect kids is the most important thing we can do. So obviously, number one, beefing up the mandatory reporting laws, but I think it's the training of teachers annually about what their requirements are. And I agree with Catherine, it's professional development that's necessary so you can spot these, what are the signs, on a regular basis. I think that's absolutely imperative, for teachers, for coaches, and as a city, any of our employees in the recreation department, employees that deal with youth, they get the annual training as well. So it's not just about what are your mandatory reporting requirements, it's also about training around what you can do to spot abuse, because those people defame the profession of educators and they hurt kids and they need to be stopped.
Well, it's missing though. It's still, once again, it's missing. It's training on how to avoid, how to operate your schools, how to operate with children in a way that does not expose them, increase the exposure to them to
Absolutely.
potential opportunities for
Absolutely,
abuse.
I agree.
Okay, so let's stay with you, Tim. Give me your assessments of the state budgets, the health of the state budget.
Well, it's obviously improving, but we still have a long way to go, particularly as it relates to the wall of debt that has been reduced but is still there. My biggest concern is regarding the STRS obligations, but I do think we're headed in the right direction with the rainy day reserve. That's one of the things we did in Dublin as mayor. We have set aside an economic uncertainty reserve, so we're going in the right direction, because right now we're relying too much on capital gains, in the peaks and valleys, and I think we need to put this money away. And universal preschool is a good example of where in the past we've committed one-time revenues to ongoing programs, and I think we're using more prudence now. So I do think we're headed in the right direction. I think now is the time to start strategizing about when Prop 30 goes away. We can't wait till 2018 and say, what do we do now? We've got this hole in our budget. So we know that, the sales tax in 2016, the income in 2018, we need to be thinking today, what are we doing long term about that? And we need to deal with the STRS issue, because I think even though a lot is good in this budget, I think that's one critical area of a long-term obligation that we're totally ignoring right now in its current form. But I do like that we're reinvesting in education and paying back Prop 98 quicker, as well as the Prop 58 obligations from 2004.
Newell?
There's $237 billion unfunded liabilities in public employee pensions. Over half of that just is in the PERS, both in pension and medical. STRS has no medical, because that's not an obligation of that. That's $80 billion. You know what? We've kicked that can down the road so long, we have to deal with it. We have to figure out a funding mechanism for that. We can talk forever on the other side how to fix it on the upstream side to not keep adding to that debt. Prop 30, Tim's right. One thing is about Prop 30, it was a temporary Band-Aid, and it's going to expire. And I don't see, even in the new plan, the way it's addressing that. The legislature sees this money coming in, and we're focusing on creating new programs where we really have decimated our state universities and state colleges. We've made it to the point our children can't afford to go there. They don't get in. Almost 80% of, I think, the freshman class of the UC system is out-of-state and foreign students. But yet you want me to pay my taxes for that. So are we doing a good job in the state budget? It looks good on paper, but it's not. You still had a $4 billion increase just in capital gains, which by the end of the year is probably going to evaporate. So we're patting each other on the back, saying we're doing a great job, but in fact, we're almost headed right back where we were. And the whole of Prop 30 is going to be equal to what we had in 2009, 2010, when that goes away. So we've got to rein in the funding.
Steve?
I would say the state of the budget health is fragile. Certainly the operating budget has been put back in alignment through the leadership of Governor Brown, and we're starting to pay off the debts that have accumulated over the last decade. Our retirement obligations for not just teachers, but for public employees is a disaster. But the politicians haven't owned up to these costs and obligations, and they keep kicking the can down the road, and I think that's a huge mistake. There is enormous deferred maintenance within the state of California, K through 12 facilities, our university and college facilities, our parks, billions in costs that no one's really talking about. So I'd say the current state of our operating budget is fragile, and it's going to require continued vigilance to constrain spending and all the good ideas that are out there to make sure that we have a long-term funding plan for the basics, for the basic priorities that the state's currently undertaking.
Our budget is a roller coaster in this state, and we've just lived through it for the last few years, where we are overly dependent on income tax, a very progressive income tax system, that in the good years, the so-called good years, there's a crazy spending spree that goes on in Sacramento. Politicians there are like a goldfish. They just fill up the tank. The larger the tank you give them, the more spending you give them, the larger the fish will get. And then whenever our economy slows, as it inevitably will from time to time, we have a dramatic crash of slashing and spending. It's almost like a yo-yo. It's so dramatic up and down. And we've just lived through this. And right now, we have a 2/3 supermajority Democratic rule, whether you call yourself a moderate Democrat or a liberal Democrat or progressive or whatever.
Actually, right this moment, we don't.
Well, in the Assembly we do.
Yeah, in the Senate,
And only under that type of one-party rule do you say, oh, we've balanced our budget, which is what happened in this last cycle with the governor and the Assembly and the legislature. They said we balanced our budget, completely ignoring.
So be specific. What are the issues you see that are not balanced?
The wall of debt of $25 billion, the $375 billion in unfunded pension liability. Teachers, CalSTARS, it's $22 million a day underfunded. That is threatening our future. I think that's the unfunded pension liability in this state is probably the single greatest financial threat, not only to services and how our state operates, but to the people who are relying on a pension down the road. And it was irresponsible to call that a balanced budget when we haven't dealt with that. It's important to remember why you need to send people to Sacramento who are not the same old interests, because that hasn't worked if you're calling things a balanced budget when you do that. The only reason the governor is even talking about a rainy day fund and calling a special session is now he needs some Republican votes. We need to end that one-party dominance in the Assembly as well, so that we can have more balance, true balance, and some real accountability in our budgeting. We'll talk more about pensions.
We're about to talk about pensions.
Oh, yes, we will.
Okay. Chuck Reed dropped his initiative, at least for the time being. Good idea or bad idea, Kathy?
Chuck Reed's initiative is one of the single most important reforms that we can make to pensions and our unfunded pension liability. And it is one that is absolutely needed. We have over 300 public employee pensions in this state, and we've already talked about how badly they're underfunded by any measure. And the first and most priority thing we need to do is remove the shackles on our local negotiating entities to be able to deal with the Supreme Court's interpretation of vested and actually change future benefits, not accrued benefits, not benefits for current retirees, but future benefits so that they can be sustainable and share the risk more evenly between employees and the local governments. We cannot tax our way out of this. We can't slash our way out of this unfunded pension liability, and Chuck Reed's proposal is critical. And it died, again, because we have a one-party system governing in Sacramento, both at the executive branch and at the assembly branch. It's one of the most needed things we have, but it's not enough. We need to have reforms also to the 1937 Act. 1937 Act, for example, that has one of the greatest flaws in it right now.
But my question had to do with
Chuck Reed, oh, I'll get to the 1937 Act whenever you're ready. But that's another, Chuck Reed's is not enough, but it's essential.
Yeah, I oppose the Chuck Reed initiative, and I think there's a couple things here. I think when you have a one-size-fits-all approach to pensions, that all local governments, have to play by the exact same rules, that assumes that local governments can't take responsibility. I know in Dublin, we paid off our retiree medical, we paid off our side fund, our employees pay their full share and almost half of the employer's share, above what Pepper requires. So.
How is Chuck Reed's initiative one-size-fits-all?
Well, because it requires, my understanding, is, basically sets the rules for all local governments in terms of what the pension, how it was orchestrated, right, in terms of the basics. And then also, the other thing I didn't like about it was it changes the rules for existing employees. That's another, I think, is a fairness issue.
No, back up
Okay.
to the first point.
Okay.
How is it one-size-fits-all?
Well, it imposed basic rules for local governments, was my understanding of the initiative, which is what one of my concerns was, is in terms of just the local control, the ability.
Basic rules for local government,
Yeah.
what do you mean by that?
Well, right now, each, as a city, I have an opportunity, our council, how we're gonna manage our pension. All of our cities, any city, you have that responsibility. You're elected locally. In terms of creating rules, that what he had. And the other thing I don't like was, the biggest thing is,
You keep sort of
yeah.
dropping over that point and not answering my question. How was it a one-size-fits-all?
Well, it was if I recall, and I haven't looked at it since the issue died, but I mean, if I recall, it's just changed the rules for, how governments, in terms of what they were able to do relative to, in terms of negotiation, what their, how the vesting worked, how, the rules operate.
It opened up a possibility.
Right.
But it left to the local governments what they do with that.
That's right.
It
Okay.
actually removes the shackles on them to individually come up with a system that works best for them and their compensation
Yeah.
package.
Yeah, no, I'm supportive of it. I think our pension problems are enormous at every level, and that we need to give local government the tools to, in a collaborative, open way, deal with the impacts, the financial impacts that they face. And I think that's, I'm a Democrat, but there's a reason that the unions have given $1 million against me so far, because I have a very independent view, including as it relates to pensions, pension obligations. And the fact is that we care about our employees, we care about the services, but we have to have a system that's financially balanced, and it's not. And we need the tools in which to make that happen.
It's actually a sad statement that we actually.
Hold on just a minute.
Sorry.
I know you want to go. No, I just don't type that fast.
You're typing pretty fast.
Go ahead, Joe.
Hey, I was going to say, I think it's a sad statement that you actually have to pass a law for something that all the local elected officials have had the right to do over the years, to basically make decisions that are financially appropriate for the cities. But the fact is they haven't. So is there going to have to be intervention? Yes.
I'm sorry, try that again with me, and what does that have to do with the Chuck Reed initiative?
Well, Chuck Reed was to basically give more right to local elected officials and those that are on the governing boards. They've had the right to basically say no to negotiations over the years. This undoes what they have done or their predecessors have done, or allows them to do
What rights do
that.
you think the Chuck Reed initiative would have gotten given?
It would have given them the ability to go, the way I read it was that they would have the ability to go back and negotiate on benefits that have been given in the past.
No.
That's the way I read it. But do we need to make reforms? Absolutely. There's no question with the path that we're going on. It's just math. You do the math, that we'll be bankrupt. And by the way, there are cities sitting at this table right here that come after June 30th this year. This is the first year, come out in the fall, when all the audits will come out. How many cities on paper would be bankrupt? When they say they paid off their debts, you're going to have a third party who's going to come in and actually analyze those, and you're going to post that.
Okay,
So
but I want to come back to the Chuck.
You said cities, plural.
I said some cities.
You said cities at this table. Okay, maybe you can clarify that.
Yeah, were you suggesting something about the cities at this table?
I meant city, I'm sorry, I mean cities in the district. That there are cities in this district, and there's probably one sitting at the table, and I've looked at the finances. We'll wait and see what comes out in the audit. But the fact is that it's going to show, even our sister city, that there are decisions that they've made, and the way they're doing the accounting, they don't fully account for it, because there's no law that says you do that in your books right now. no law at all.
Okay, but let me
So,
back
Chuck
up.
Reed's
Chuck
proposal.
Reed's proposal.
Chuck Reed's proposal, I support it in concept. I think I would have made the changes in different ways. And that would be to give the ability,
What is the concept you're supporting?
the concept that I support is that public agencies, if they don't have the backbone to make their own decisions, then the state is stepping in, right? That's the reason for an initiative. So the state steps in because they can't make the decisions. If we're gonna do that, then let's look at all the items on the list. That why shouldn't all employees pay their fair share on both medical costs? Why should a public employer pay 100% of medical costs for a family?
I think on the Chuck Reed issue, I've heard what I need to hear.
Okay.
On it. Okay,
I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding about what it does.
Yes,
It doesn't do
I
anything.
think
Yeah.
there is clear fundamental misunderstandings about what it does. Yes, I think that's very clear. Okay, Steve has made a big issue during this campaign on this issue of promises made, questionnaires signed. It's an interesting issue that's frankly gotten a lot of buzz. He's gotten a lot of press out of it. But it's an interesting issue. I'd like to get each of your reactions to whether you think what he's saying is a good idea or a bad idea, and the implications of it. Starting with you, Tim.
Yeah, I mean, I look at this, I mean, we all, I think we could all agree there's too much money in politics. I mean, it's one of the things, it's part of the process. So we all have different people who are supporting our campaigns. People that are supporting Steve are into individuals or groups that don't have questionnaires. There are some that are supporting me that have questionnaires. So I think it's really political when you're saying, well, we want to see your questionnaires, but we don't know what meetings any other candidate has had with any other group that doesn't have anything like that. So I think it's pretty clear when you look at the disclosures in terms of who's funded, you understand based on their websites what those organizations are all about. So I think people, and we give our opinions here on tape all the time talking to voters. So I think it's pretty clear where our positions are, and people can make their own decisions, talk to voters every day.
See, you've got this all lined up here. We'll come to you last, Steve. Newell?
I'm the only one sitting here who doesn't have any of that kind of money, who doesn't have any special entrance. I don't have any Indian gambling casinos. I don't have any of that special money. Somebody sitting next to me is good at getting. It's what he does for a living. Tim's getting all the union money and stuff. I actually go out, I have met with probably 100 different groups.
Yeah, but
and they all want you to fill out a
Okay, go
questionnaire. And the first thing I say, I'll sit down and talk to you. I don't want any money. And they look at me and they say, well, wait a minute, why are you here? I'm here to understand what your issue is, to understand it so I can well be informed in the future, whether it be for or against an issue. I'm not participating in these. Planned Parenthood, I did. It's one of my organizations that I've supported for a long time. I don't take any money from them. That's the first thing I say in the interview. I don't want your money. I'm interested because we have a shared value. I'm interested in listening and talking to. And I think I've done 5. But I didn't participate in any of those because the questions they ask, one of the professional engineers said, will you guarantee us that you will always support us and never go back on our pensions? I can't say that, period. We shouldn't be doing that. And most importantly, don't take the money. Keep the money from your district. Don't take it from, South Carolina energy companies. All these special, that's easy money to get. Stay away from all of this. You want to have reform, which is the issue, then bring your own money from the district, from people that support you in the district.
Okay, Catherine?
A couple things. First of all, I have to correct a factual error. I didn't know I was getting the big funding that Steve or Tim is getting, but I am the only candidate that is getting none of the funding from inside Sacramento interests, where Steve is very well known, or public employee unions that Tim's very involved in. But I am getting, and I've raised over $230,000 from my community, from individuals who come forward on a bipartisan basis and say, this is the kind of representation we want in Sacramento. So I'll correct that one point. Look, the questionnaires, it's a very inside Sacramento game about these questionnaires, and so is the whole idea. If you look on Steve's website, he posts the questionnaires he gets, but not his answers to them, which I find very uninformative and helpful. to people to understand the issue. I'm a very different candidate than what Steve's used to working with as a political consultant in Sacramento or anybody else here. I've been sent the same questionnaires. I read them. I don't make pledges to anyone, least of all secret ones about how I will and won't vote. Very transparent in what I believe and share with people and invite feedback, but I haven't been filling these out. I find them informative to read. There is one exception though. I did get the CTA's questionnaire and said, look, it's 40 pages and it's not say it in your own words. It's check the box what you will or won't promise to do. And I said, look, I'm happy to meet with your organization. You've got local teachers, I want to hear what you have to say. Let's schedule an appointment. Each time I tried to schedule it, it didn't work out. Finally, it was scheduled on the day of one of my fundraisers, right after I announced I'm having a meet and greet coffee with people. So I would have been happy to meet with them, but there needs to be that back and forth. And you won't see me sign these and make some pledge or commitment. It's a very different way of running, and you've got to get away from all of this special interest domination, whether it's special interest PACs who've been the seed money for Steve or public employee unions who've been supporting Tim. You've just got to focus on transparent in what your opinions are. Don't make secret pledges to people or public ones in papers or otherwise. And I'd love to see you post your answers.
Great, I'm happy to do that. So, let me just say this, that I challenge my opponents to do a very simple thing. When you get these questionnaires, and here's 30 of them right here in front of me, more than 600 questions. If you get these questionnaires and you decide to fill them out, no problem. Just post the answers so everybody can see. So there's transparency. These questionnaires have become a very insidious part of campaigns today, and they explain a lot about how people govern today because they don't need to read a bill because they've already made a promise about it. So what I have promised is that if I fill out these questionnaires or I make any kind of written promise on a state policy issue, I'll post my answers on my webpage. And that's what I've done.
You put the answers on your webpage?
Yes, and I think, Catherine, the reason you're having trouble seeing that is because I've filled out none of them. I've never filled out a questionnaire.
Oh,
Excuse me,
Asian
please.
Pacific.
Let me finish. And where I have made written statements, I have put those statements on my webpage. So you can go to my webpage and see all the statements that I've made today. It's the most robust collection of information about my position, certainly than anybody around this table. And it's all there at glazerforassembly.com.
So let's just, so that's, you've put up every written promise and every questionnaire. Reasonable?
Well, wait a minute, that's disingenuous. Let's be honest. Tim, in most cases, probably doesn't have to fill them out because none of us are going after that
he's
money.
filled them out.
But maybe he has, maybe he hasn't. But he's not filling out a piece of paper when he gets it from a Las Vegas casino or an Indian gambling casino or an energy company back east, who, by the way, writes a check for one reason. And by the way, it's easy money to get. I go to Sacramento, and they're going like this, trying to stuff checks in your pocket. I'm saying, I don't want it. Why are you at the table? What is your issue and why? A good debate is how can you argue both sides of an issue? So
your point is
it's the same criminal.
Your point is it doesn't have to be in writing to make it just as insidious.
These are the worst ones. The worst ones are the ones where you take the money from these interests and we don't know what they've agreed. We should stop all that money. That's the money that needs to stop. So
are you making a charge, though? Are you making a charge?
I'm just reading off of the money that you've gotten.
But you're saying that I filled out their questionnaires?
No, I said I don't know what promises you've made.
Okay,
maybe you did, maybe you didn't. But it doesn't come without a
promise.
So
let's identify what's going on here. This is and then we're going to wrap this up. But basically, there are two issues here. What are the written promises? What are the verbal promises? Right?
Sure.
But,
Okay.
but I think this whole thing about written promises, I think is, we've all, okay, all right.
So this question, what are the written promises, what are the verbal promises? And I get it, you can't control the verbal promises. But is it reasonable, given that you can't control the verbal promises, to at least ask to see and put up the written promises?
It's even better, Dan, it's even better not to make them. To say what you believe, be transparent about what you believe, welcome feedback and input, but not play this very insider game. It's much more important than whether you post it, is it on the website, have I done this pledge? Speak in your own words, say what you believe, and be transparent about it. And you're just seeing a great play out of that.
But my question is, all things being equal, if these things are out there, is it a good idea or not a good idea?
But you got to put them both out there, Dan, to be honest. You can't just say, I want to put this because he's after him off of public employee unions. And they're the ones that do that. And his money has the unspoken word. We don't know what it is. So somehow they have to both be out there.
Have you-
Otherwise, you're
let me ask
isolating
you,
one
Steve,
group.
Have there been verbal promises?
No. And by the way, it's not just public employee unions, it's the Sierra Club, it's the nurses, it's the NRA, it's Planned Parenthood, it's the realtors. Look at, it's all these questionnaires are on my website for everybody to see, so you can
But
go,
Steve, the better
hold on,
solution
please,
is
let
to
me
just
finish.
not fill them out.
I get that's
Yeah.
your point, but I think what Dan is asking is, if you have filled out written promises, written commitments, why shouldn't everybody see them? And that's really a very simple request. You can say, but that doesn't include verbal, well, we could argue about that, but he's saying, go ahead and disclose. Tim, you filled out a lot of these, haven't you?
Look, I've been.
And so why aren't you letting everybody see what your answers are?
I have been proudly supported by labor my entire time in office.
It's not just about labor.
And environmental groups, and I've always said you could be pro-business, pro-labor, and pro-environment. I think part of the problem in Sacramento is these false choices. You have to choose a side. Are you with business, or are you with labor, or are you with the environment? And I think very clearly, my whole time, these are questionnaires, so that way you get some information, they kind of know where you stand, share the values. There's no promises, there's no guarantees. You know, look, I love what I'm doing. I'm a teacher and a coach, and I love it.
If we saw the questionnaires you filled out, there weren't any pledges like you will describe of will you support us on staff?
They want to know where you generally stand, but it's the same thing like what
There
Neil was
are
saying
all
about.
the- no, there
but-
are several of them.
Here's
now.
the
Yeah, but
CTA,
it's-
36 questions, yes or
didn't
no.
fill any of
Did you
those.
fill this out? Did you fill out the CTA questionnaire?
Well, I filled out questionnaires, but I mean, just like Newell
then
said,
why don't you just-
He
everybody.
didn't have to for CTA.
Everybody-
Nobody
No,
went to the
you said he
interviews.
filled it out. Don't
Not
get-
CTA.
Yeah, you
No, I
filled
filled
out
out
CTA.
every- yeah, I
You don't
filled
know
it
what
out.
you're talking about.
I filled out other questionnaires, but I think the issue is,
Right.
it's pretty transparent when you know an
Okay,
organization.
so let me just ask.
Yeah.
This is why we need something different.
Let me just ask all of you.
I would agree. There's
Let me
too much
just
money
ask
in
you,
politics. I
can't ask
completely
you to
agree.
I can't ask you to disclose your verbal promises unless you want to, but would you disclose all your written
Yes,
questionnaires?
absolutely yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't think I have any, but sure.
Yeah, I just think it's disingenuous. I think it's
Okay.
purely
So the
political when
answer's
you say
no.
one side, you know,
Okay.
yeah, and the other side doesn't. I think it's just
It's not
political.
one side, Tim. It's every
Okay,
questionnaire.
That's fine, that's enough, okay.
And by the way, Dan, can I say this, because Newell was pretty sharp about this. When he goes to Sacramento, he doesn't ask for money, okay? And Newell, you'll tell me that you've been going to Sacramento once a week.
That's,
And I just want to say that he's hired a Sacramento fundraiser, so why would you hire a Sacramento fundraiser if you're not trying to raise money?
They actually I hired them to help me make the introductions because I didn't know how to contact those people.
So
And
you
I
hired
raised
a fundraiser-
no money from any of those people.
You
so I
asked them
wouldn't
for
take it.
money.
No, I
You
didn't.
asked them for
Folks, I
Did
don't
not.
wanna go there right now.
Don't want
There's an important point to be
Didn't need it.
seen here, which is there's a competition about who's funded by whom. I don't have a Third House or Sacramento fundraiser.
Same
I don't
here.
have a district fundraiser. I raised through the support of people in my community. And my seed money did not come from the PACs in Sacramento or other organizations, came from
campaigns.
folks in my campaigns. There's so many more substantive issues.
I-
I love to
I
talk more
agree.
about
There's a lot of
education
Thank
and
you,
others.
we've run out of time.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I thank all of you for coming in.